here is Jesus saying, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of these men, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I was trying to think of what might be a modern equivalent of the kind of shock that Jesus was giving. I thought about Mother Teresa. Now, you know, of course, that for a great many people in the world, they look upon Mother Teresa as being a woman of the most exceptional and outstanding godliness and holiness and compassion and Christian piety. Please understand, I am not making any comment at all about Mother Teresa. I am neither commending nor condemning or saying anything about her apart from the fact that that is her reputation. That is how so many people think of Mother Teresa. And if you were to say to them, you know, unless you are more holy, more pious, more compassionate, more caring than Mother Teresa, God will never let you into heaven, they would be shocked. And that is the kind of response that Jesus must have received when he said these words about the scribes and the Pharisees. To most of his hearers, these scribes and the Pharisees, they were the holiest men that they knew. And if Jesus is saying, as he is saying, that their righteousness was not sufficient to take them into heaven, then the reaction of his hearers would inevitably be, then what possible hope is there for me? If these men are not saved, how in all the world can I possibly be saved? Well, we need to look this morning at this matter of the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. What was the problem with the righteousness of these men? There were three basic problems. First of all, it was meritorious righteousness. The Pharisee thought that he would get to heaven on the basis of his personal obedience to the law. One of the ancient Pharisees actually speaks of the 10 Commandments as being a ladder which God has given to the people of Israel, that by the commandments they might ascend into heaven. And the first thing that was wrong was that to the Pharisee, his righteousness was going to be the means of taking him to heaven. Well, from that, there was a second error, which is inevitable given the first, which was that his righteousness had to be attainable by human effort. Since it was by keeping God's law that he would be saved, naturally it had to be possible for him to keep God's law. And so he believed that by his zeal and by his effort, he could keep the law of God. He saw no need to be born again. He never had the experience of the Apostle Paul as he looked at God's law and exclaimed, "Oh, wretched man that I am," aware of his failure in relation to the law. No, the law was something which by his own grit and determination he would keep. And therefore that led to the third error, which was that inevitably, if you think that the law is something that by your own determination, without any help from God, that you can keep, then you have got to reduce the law to purely external requirements. And the Pharisee was perfectly happy if he kept outwardly the letter of the law. Now, in each of these, the Pharisee and the scribe was wrong. The Bible tells us that by the deeds of the law, there shall no human being be justified in God's sight. we cannot get to heaven by our own efforts. Secondly, we cannot keep God's standards by our own efforts. Jesus says that which is born of the flesh, mere human nature, is flesh. That which is born of the Spirit is spirit. We know that the law, says Paul, the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. I cannot attain to God's holy standards. And thirdly, we are told that the Lord looks upon the heart. The psalmist says, you desire truth in the inward parts. Create for me a clean heart, O God. And God's law is not limited simply to our outward actions, what we do. God's law searches our hearts and what we are and what we think and what we feel inwardly as much as anything that we do outwardly. And our Lord, in saying that your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, undoubtedly has particular regard to this third point, that God's law extends to the heart. It is not simply a matter of outward actions. And really, in the remainder of this chapter, verses 21 to 48, our Lord is simply showing us, by means of 6 examples, what he means by righteousness exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. He is going to go on by these 6 examples to contrast the Pharisaic righteousness, which was just about the outward letter, the outward action, with true righteousness, which is righteousness of the heart. Each of these 6 illustrations begins with essentially the same formula. He says, with slight variation in the words, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And in each case, he contrasts the interpretation of the scribes and the Pharisees with his own interpretation. He is not contradicting the law of God, which he has just said he would never do, but he is certainly exposing the erroneous understanding of the scribes and the Pharisees. And he is showing us the true significance of God's law. Well, this morning we're going to look only at the first of these illustrations, as we find it in verses 21 to 26. And it is an illustration relating to the 6th commandment. The 6th of the 10 commandments says, you shall not murder. On the face of it, this 6th commandment is one of the easiest to keep. The vast majority of human beings, Christians and non-Christians alike, get through life without committing outward murder. Even among criminals who are, if you like, professional lawbreakers, they may be thieves and fraudsters and commit all manner of crimes. Even among criminals, many would shrink from committing murder. That is a step too far. And on the face of it, therefore, most of us are entirely blameless in relation to this commandment. Most of us can say, I have never unjustly taken anyone's life. And the scribes and the Pharisees certainly were perfectly satisfied that they were blameless in respect of this commandment. Our Lord shows this in the quotation that he gives us. He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old," here is the traditional scribal interpretation, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment." Now, we need to think carefully about that statement. What is wrong with it? You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. Well, the first part is simply the 6th commandment, you shall not murder, perfectly accurately quoted. Whoever murders shall be in danger of the judgment is a perfectly accurate little summary of more than one passage of the Old Testament about what the judges were to do in the case of murder. We read Deuteronomy 19, and we read about the cities of refuge, which were designed for the protection of those who may have accidentally killed someone. But then we went on to read that there was to be no protection for the man who willingly, deliberately set out to murder his neighbor. If he fled to one of these cities, then he was to be given up. He was to be handed over to justice. He was to face the judgment of the state. And indeed, he was to be put to death. Well, I say that the second part is a perfectly accurate little summary in a few words of the fact that the state was to deal with it. But you see, there is a problem here. Because what they have done is they have taken the great moral principle of the 10 Commandments, you shall not murder, and they have attached to that great moral principle the specific judicial requirements for the state of Israel. The first is the moral law of God. The second consists of instructions to the civil magistrates. And you see, by putting the two together, they are really dragging down the commandment to make sure that it only refers to what the civil magistrate can deal with, actual outward murder. They are reducing it from having any deeper spiritual meaning which would not be accessible to the judgment of the state. And our Lord is challenging not the words themselves, which I say are quite accurate, but he is challenging what lay behind their putting these two together. Their treatment of the commandment, you shall not murder, as though God himself would be perfectly satisfied if you get through life without actually killing your neighbor. And he goes on to show that God's moral commandment, as opposed to the civil or criminal law given for Israel, God's moral commandment goes far beyond the outward act of killing. In the first place, he says, it condemns unrighteous anger. I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Why does our Lord link anger with the 6th commandment? What is the connection, the relation between anger and murder? Well, it's not hard to see. Murder is simply the ultimate fruit of unrighteous anger. No one ever murdered another person without first having anger against him